Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro, friends. Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Elixir of Specialty Coffee and our upcoming assertiveness training for the hospitality industry happening here in Sydney, Australia on Saturday, the 21st of September. That's this Saturday. Get your tickets. Get your tickets at mapperforward.org/events. Today on the Daily Coffee Pro, we're talking about the tipping game. It's especially interesting to me, having now come back to a culture or a coffee culture that I was raised in, where tipping was not a common practice at all. We would maybe receive a couple of dollars per shift in tips on the high side, just from customers that were throwing extra change when it came to tipping throughout my career. It's not a practice here in Sydney, but having lived in the US for the last 4 years, where there's a lot of the culture that depends on tipping, the interesting and complex ways in which staffing is set up both front of house and back of house with regards to tipping is very interesting and intriguing when it comes to cultures that have tipping in it, like the American hospitality industry. And I know that the coffee community doesn't necessarily consider themselves as a part of the hospitality industry in America, but it is a part of, technically, a part of the hospitality trade. My personal opinion on tipping is I don't like the practice. The reason I don't like the practice is because I feel that we're the only industry, the hospitality industry, we're the only industry where we require our customers to subsidize our employees' wages. And I think that sends the wrong kind of signaling to a number of directions. I think it sends the wrong signal to our employees, and I think it sends the wrong signal to our customers. It also doesn't, in my personal opinion, foster the kind of culture that you can come to, where you can breed trust. It's just, I've tried to wrap my head around it so many times and try to understand why people would think, and employers would think that counting on our customers to subsidize our employees' wages is going to foster a sense of loyalty or commitment or any of those necessary emotions or traits in a workforce when that's going on. It is complex further because without it, some people would get paid a lot less money. So for those who aren't familiar, in some high volume cafes in the US, some baristas can earn 10, like really high volume cafes, $10, $12, $15 an hour extra in tips some hours throughout their shift. And so if they're getting paid minimum wage, which in California is almost at $14 an hour, $13.50, depending on what city you live in, $13.50, $14 an hour. And by 2020, in most cities across California, in Seattle, Washington, the minimum wage is going to be $15. So if minimum wage is $15 and your tips are at $15, you're getting paid more than an Australian barista that isn't getting tipped out at all. And that's a lot of money. That's a livable wage. And so the wage was increased, or is being increased, to $15 an hour as a minimum wage for the purposes of that being what people need to have as a livable wage. Add to that the $15 an hour in tips. The average number of tips that people are earning is somewhere between $3 an hour and $6 an hour in tips. But very high volume cafes are earning somewhere around the $10 an hour for some baristas. Now, if you look at the bar culture, they're earning in the order of sometimes hundreds of dollars an hour in tips. Fine dining, the same thing. Restaurants, the same thing. It can be very lucrative. And so while some people are arguing that tipping fosters a culture where employees are never really 100% loyal to their employer, because their employer isn't necessarily paying their wages. Their customers are paying the bulk of their wages. Then why would you get rid of it? It's a really complex one. I think from the customer perspective, if I'm going in and I'm buying a $4 latte or a $3.50 latte, and then on top of that, I have to pay an extra dollar every time I buy a coffee, I feel ripped off. Especially as I'm not guaranteed that I'm going to have an exceptional experience. I'm paying a reasonable price for the product that I'm purchasing. And that should be enough for the transaction. I buy the product and I get the product. But not only do I have to buy the product, I have to buy the product and compensate the person who's standing there and taking my order, and who's making the coffee, because I've decided to come and patron your business. But isn't that your responsibility as the business owner? Shouldn't you be responsible for paying your employees' wages in order to control the level of awesomeness that your team contribute to conspiring to your success? Now, another layer of that complexity is the back of house staff. So if you're tipping out the front of house staff, the back of house staff, and that could be in situations where you've got cafes that have a kitchen or restaurants that have a kitchen, the back of house staff are not always tipped out. The dishwasher is not always tipped out. The servers and the runners, they're rarely tipped out. And in some situations, because I'm following this whole thing very carefully of places that are trying to shift tipping systems, there's always backlash. So while people want it to change, they want it to change, but they don't want it to change in a way that it affects their take-home pay. So there are some places that are saying we're now going to start tipping out the back of house staff, and we're going to pay them 20% of the tip pool every night, every day. Where that gets complicated is the tip pool ends up meaning, if you're taking 20% of the tipping pool, you've decreased all the front of house staff's wages, if you're including the tips, by 20%. So the amount that they're tipped out is reduced by 20%. And this can be, this is their salary, this is their livelihood. And this is where people are like, don't fuck with my tips. I know it's a horrible practice, but this is a part of my livelihood. And so while I have the opinion, and a lot of people have the opinion that come into the US and watch this happen, this is a very ungracious way of showing gratitude to our employees, both as as an employer and as a customer. I mean, I don't want customers, if I owned a cafe, I would hate for my customers to feel obligated to pay extra on top of what they're buying for the product. In my opinion, part of my job is to cost out my wages as a part of my cost of doing business or my COGS. I shouldn't be leaving the uncertainty of how much my employees are taking home up to the gratuity of my customers. It's an unfair burden, in my opinion. And I think it's a practice that needs to be changed, but I'm well aware of my naivety in that situation, because it is naive to think that something that's so ingratiated into a culture, like the American culture, could possibly change. There's a lot of people that have tried to do it and it's just too complex. People don't like change. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Where do you stand when it comes to tipping? Do you like the practice? Do you dislike the practice? What are your ideas about how it might change or be improved? Let me know. Peace, love, and peanut butter, friends. Have an amazing rest of your day.